Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day, and let's begin. I'm joined today by Anthony Vinci. Anthony served as the first chief technology officer at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Earlier in his career, he served in Iraq, Africa, and Asia. After leaving the world of intelligence, he became an executive at a private equity firm and CEO of an AI company. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and received his PhD in international relations at the London School of Economics, which I will not hold against him as a graduate of King's College London. He joins me today, though, to discuss his fantastic and incredibly timely book, The Fourth Intelligence Revolution, published by Henry Holt. Anthony, or should I say Dr. Vinci, welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I'm really excited to dive in this book because I am a huge fan of the intelligence community, the practice of intelligence, and just how much is transforming right now, effectively in real time. Before we get to where we are today, I want to go back to where we've come from and talk about the revolutions that you set the stage for with this book. So, what was the first intelligence revolution and where did we come from to get to today?
Yeah, great question. Well, intelligence goes back to the beginning of civilization, so it's hard to start a book there. And even in America, George Washington was running spies, so we've always had intelligence here. But where I started the book was World War II, because that's where we had this first true revolution where we created what we consider to be an intelligence agency today in the form of the OSS. And that organization basically looks like the CIA today. It had an operations unit, it had an analysis unit, it had communications and so forth. And that was kind of I call it the Big Bang for U.S. intelligence. And then from there, we actually closed down that agency after World War II. President Truman said he didn't want there to be an American Gestapo. We had always been a little suspicious of intelligence in America, still are. And but the Cold War reality set in 1947. We set up the CIA and then subsequently set up several other agencies like the NSA and DIA. And that was the second revolution. That's when we really professionalized intelligence in America. We funded it heavily. We went global. We went peacetime. America really didn't have peacetime intelligence agencies before that. And that worked really well up until 9/11. And 9/11 broke a lot of things in intelligence because in this strange way, we had made too perfect of an intelligence agency and in community. We were so good at compartmenting information and practicing intelligence against what, for years had done so against the KGB, that this decentralized terrorist group, Al Qaeda, was able to slip through the cracks between agencies because the CIA was not talking to the FBI and vice versa and so forth. And that perfection of intelligence became the weakness that they preyed upon. And so after 9/11, we had to create a new way of doing intelligence, this whole of government approach where we created the ODNI. We created what we today call the intelligence community, where lots of different agencies were practicing intelligence. And that's where we stood up until recently, and this fourth intelligence revolution that I wrote about in the book.
So the key thing that really strikes me in the fourth intelligence revolution is this is really a technology-driven global intelligence race is really what it sounds like. And this is what I think makes this book especially interesting is this connection of the technology component and the intelligence component. We've shifted from, as you said, the 9/11 era where it was a find, fix, finish, exploit, and then repeat the cycle. What characterizes this particular revolution right now? I mean, how would you characterize that if find, fix, and finish was where we came from in the 9/11 era?
Yeah, these revolutions have been driven, in my view, by two things. One is a new enemy, and that or adversary. That adversary for us right now is China. It was the Soviet Union, it was Al Qaeda, now it's China. And then technology typically does drive it. And so satellites, for example, during the Cold War, or it was network intelligence, like social network analysis post 9/11. Today, it's artificial intelligence is driving. And those two factors have really led us down this path. And this new revolution is characterized by three things because of those adversaries in this new technology. One is that intelligence, the scope of intelligence is expanding because the scope of competition is expanding. The US and China compete economically. We compete over science and technology. We compete in other things versus historically, typically intelligence was about competing politically and militarily. We spied on generals, we spied on politicians, and so forth. Now that's changing, and companies are part of the game, for example. It's not that we didn't used to do any economic intelligence, but now it's really become significantly more important and widespread. The second thing is that AI is going to do everything in intelligence. And we're having this kind of national dialogue. It's a global dialogue right now of what is AI going to do? It's going to take jobs. People talk about it taking lawyers' jobs and accountants' jobs and things like that. Well, same thing is going to happen in intelligence, right? Because AI can do analysis. It can disseminate intelligence. In fact, what I think is going to happen is AI is going to spy on other AI because China has its own AI. The third, and I think this is the most radical change that we're going to see, the most disruptive one, is that intelligence is now expanding to incorporate everyone. China spies on its entire population and uses that for social control, and it wants to do that globally. And so everyone is now part of the intelligence world, and they're collecting data via Huawei, via TikTok, via all of these other pathways. And they want to use this for information operations, ultimately social control. And that changes everything about intelligence, and it creates a world in which we all, and by we, I mean literally all American citizens, are now part of intelligence and have to become resilient. And maybe we can talk more about that later.
I do definitely want to come to that, but I want to pick up two threads that sort of you highlighted here. So if you look back at the 9/11 era, the failure of the pre 9/11 intelligence community said basically it was too perfect. It was too focused and effective on a traditional state-on-state adversary that allowed the Al Qaeda and others to slip through the cracks. If we fast forward to today, post sort of ODNI reforms, post repositioning of the intelligence community, is the intelligence community as it stands prepared for these three revolutions that you're talking about? I mean, they seem to be happening fast and furious. I mean, the AI revolution is in real time. Is the community oriented for, prepared for, or built for adapting in this environment?
Unfortunately, it's not. And the intelligence community needs to adapt just like it did after 9/11 and just like it did after 1947 and just like it did in 1941, right? And that's the meaning of the revolution. I do think people in the intelligence community are beginning to realize some of these issues. They know that they need to bring artificial intelligence in. But once you're doing that, it's not just bringing on another AI tool like another piece of software. It's not just, hey, let's bring in a little more Palantir. It means you have to reconfigure all of the workflows. You have to reconfigure what it means to do intelligence, because this isn't just a tool you put in the hands of, say, an imagery analyst to identify a fighter jet on an image. AI means actually doing the intelligence, and you're removing the person from doing that, which means you now have to incorporate this new AI into your workflow and your process. You have to figure out, how do I trust it? How do I know that this works? I have to tell users, I have to tell customers that this was generated by AI. And that means a lot of reorganization of processes, of workflows, of how do you promote people and analysts when most of their job might get done by AI, right? That's where the revolution really comes in, and it's going to be drastic. But even more radically is that the IC, to adapt to this world, to compete in economic areas, science and technology areas, has to be far more open. It opened up after 9/11, right? We created InQtel. We created a CIA funded public venture capital agents organization like that. that was a big deal, but it has to open up even more and work in these public-private partnerships to compete. And beyond that, we actually have to figure out how to treat the entire American population as part of the as part of what's under threat, right? As what is being spied on, and then figure out how to protect them and do so with well preserving the rights and freedoms of people and private information and so forth. And that is probably the most radical change that has to happen, and it's not ready for that. Let me say one more thing about what I really mean by a revolution. Imagine you traveled back in time to 1982 and you walked into Director Bill Casey's office at the CIA. This is the height of the Cold War. It's Ronald Reagan. It's the buildup. CIA was as secret as it gets at that time. And you told him in 20-something years, the CIA is going to fund and operate a public venture capital company that's going to invest in American companies. He would have looked at you like you were insane. Like, he would have just been like, it's not what the CIA does. It's not what the CIA will ever do. I've got Lockheed Martin and people that build special things for me. I don't need, first of all, I don't even know what Silicon Valley is, but I'm pretty sure I don't need it, right? That's what a real revolution looks like, that the future is unimaginable. Well, when I say there's a revolution, it's as unimaginable as imagine going into Director Radcliffe's office right now at the CIA and saying, in 20 years, not only will the CIA work with people, most intelligence will actually be generated by regular people at home, similar to Wikipedia. And that you will actually maybe just be in an assist function or doing something very narrow. And the CIA will actually be a minor player. He's going to look at you like you're insane, because, right? And I don't know, that's what I'm trying to flesh out in the book, is how big of a change we're really talking about.
I want to tease that out a little bit, because it's a very interesting point. If we look at the war in Ukraine specifically, the amount of publicly available open source intelligence from just individual Ukrainians on the ground tracking Russian assets, to commercial satellites, to the role of Starlink, for example, it seems that there's a democratization of intelligence happening, which I think you're kind of talking about with the sort of Wikipedia idea. If that is the case in the direction it's going, what does the CIA become? We saw criticism certainly during the post 9/11 era that the agency in particular became very focused on target prosecution, taking individuals off the battlefield, and less focus, and some critics were saying less focus on the human intelligence side. So if the shift has gone back to nation state adversaries, with terrorism still being a threat for sure, and you have this democratization of intelligence, where does the CIA in particular find its niche? What does it look like in 2035?
Yep. I think that it weirdly is sort of a return to where we came from, which is America's always had these community organizations. De Tocqueville talked about this. We've always had militias. We've had, community policing and so forth, going back decades, neighborhood watches. And I think about it in that kind of parallel. And what I picture in 20 years is something like this. The CIA is still there. It is equivalent to, say, the police, right? Where professional, they have a job, they do specific things that nobody else can do. They're well funded, right? They do the most secret things that cannot be done in open source, nor would you want them to be done in open source. But in parallel, there is also people who are equivalent to like a neighborhood watch, right? Where they do have tools. They have a connection with the police, in this case, maybe with the CIA, where they're feeding them information around information operations or something like that. They have some training, right? We can teach people to do intelligence. And as an example, I point to like Bellingcat, which is a citizen journalist site where people learn to do open source intelligence very well, in fact, and have tracked down stories and broken stories that even professional journalists couldn't break. And then we also have, if you just think about our society, everyone is sort of trained to protect themselves against crime a little bit. We teach our children, don't leave things out on the sidewalk because they might get stolen. You learn to drive, and you learn, I need to lock my car when I'm parking it because it could get broken into, right? We all have some level of resiliency. Well, I think in the future we will all have some level of resiliency against intelligence collection and information operations. So there will be kind of three levels of this. The CIA will still be there and be very important, but intelligence will expand so much that we will all become part of the system.
A flip side of that this raises, I mean, naturally, the Central Intelligence Agencies focuses on overseas collection and delivery of intelligence for policymakers like the president to make decisions. If you're talking about an expansion of the aperture of what intelligence is considered, but also who is either directly or indirectly collecting it, that seems to suggest there's going to be a fundamental need for a parallel revolution in the oversight process. You have the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. You have the Gang of Eight for Informed of Covert Actions. What does the regulatory environment and the oversight mechanism look like when you've expanded this aperture so much? At least in the social media space with Bellingcat, as I understand it, there's a bit of self-correction for errors, if you will. Yeah. But then if you have this mechanism, I mean, what does Congress do in this new space?
That's a very insightful question. So one, we have set up some, since in the last revolution, in the third revolution, we set up new means of oversight because we expanded into this whole of government approach. And all of a sudden, agencies that had never done intelligence or been involved in it really were now involved. You had, TSA and Department of Transportation are all of a sudden involved in this intelligence process, and we had to figure out how to regulate them. And to your point, the same thing will happen. Now, we can expand some of that, and as there's more and more intelligence collection on the American people, we realize that the American people as a whole are now under threat. We will need Congress to figure out how to regulate some of this collection. What we don't want to happen is we don't want to go back to over collection of the American people. I don't think any of us want that happening again. And nobody wants another Edward Snowden revelation or something. So it becomes this question of how are we going to strike that balance and protect American people's rights, but also protect them from being spied upon. And that's where I think we will need Congress partially, but I also think that we need a public debate, as it were, to figure out where is the line now and how do we protect ourselves. And this is partially why I believe everyone should be trained in intelligence and take part in the intelligence process to protect ourselves. And because we don't want the CIA or even the FBI, for that matter, it could be domestic law enforcement, involved in, for example, censoring what Americans see. So I actually believe that the Trump administration was right to shut down the Counter Foreign Malign Influence Center because, first of all, it wasn't working that well, just practically. Not that it was their fault. It's a hard problem. I think the people there in those offices tried the best they could, but it's not what we're set up to do. And there's just too much of a threat of tyranny, frankly, of control over information from our own government. So I think it's time to offload a lot of that effort into civil society and let people self-regulate it. And to your point, the folks in Bellingcat have figured out ways to do this. People in Wikipedia have figured out ways to do this. How do we self-regulate what can and cannot happen? And I think the same thing needs to happen in civil society. Congress may also play a role in that, and people still need to follow laws. So just because you can use open source intelligence tools doesn't mean you should be using them against your neighbors. You should be using them against threats. And so you still need to follow rules and laws and so forth, and Congress making laws and states, for that matter, and need to kind of play a role in doing that. But we all need to kind of self-regulate. And in order to do that, I think people need, as a whole, to know more about how intelligence works, more about where the threats are coming from, more about what tools are out there. And partially that's why I wrote the book, is to start to kind of educate the American public on what's going on.
Well, you raised an interesting question. It's been very keen with your background, particularly in the AI and the private equity space, because a lot of what you were just describing is replicated in the commercial space. So the Facebooks of the world, the Metas of the world, these ecosystems are collecting an incredible amount of data, hyper-specific data on users, and in some cases, by virtue of the algorithm, making decisions on what people do and do not see. The flip side is we've seen the debate over TikTok, which is now in the process of being sold off, as being a vector for foreign malign influence, either directly or unintentionally, depending on how one looks at it. Where do companies end up on this ecosystem? What role do they play? Because you have concerns obviously about the federal government collecting data, but we're okay with Alphabet having all of my data. But then people want to be using TikTok because it's great for comedy videos and funny cat and dog videos. So where do companies play in this? And then how do we deal with foreign adversarial owned, operated, or guided networks?
It's a subtle and super important issue, and I think we need to sort of cut with a scalpel. So, in my view, we should not have foreign owned and operated, especially authoritarian country foreign owned and operated information or technology sites available in America. The threat far outweighs any benefit we gain from allowing them. And the threat from TikTok was very real, demonstrated by many researchers that there was foreign influence, there was Chinese influence on it. It may look like it's just videos of people dancing, but it's been established how not only were they collecting information, but they were using that for information operations and to change and influence people's views covertly. Mm-hmm. That we need to halt that. That's a role. That is where Congress and presidential administrations comes in. For American companies, they provide the platforms at the end of the day where this happens. And it's a really hard balance to strike where we want to, I believe, kind of minimize regulation as much as we can in order to make the capitalist system work well, but at the same time, protect users of it. And as it relates to national security, we need to have some rules of the road of what can happen and what can happen. So some things are pretty straightforward. There should be rules around insider threats within those social media platforms. You're running something that is in many ways kind of utility. Lots of American citizens use it. Well, if you're letting the equivalent of a foreign spy or hacker work at your agency, and that becomes the leak of Americans' data, we should regulate that. They shouldn't be able to do that, right? So there's some things that are fairly straightforward. The harder question becomes, well, what do you do when there's this question of what they should post or shouldn't post by policy or because of the algorithm? And I think essentially what's happened is they tried several different experimental approaches to doing this. Sometimes they were regulating it, like changing what could be said about COVID. That was pretty well established that happened. I think the American people have sort of come back and said, we don't like that. We don't want that to happen. I'm a bit in that camp. I don't think that companies should determine, just as a government shouldn't determine what gets censored, I don't think it's a good idea for a company to determine what gets censored. And so we've sort of moved into this new experimental regime, which is community notes, which kind of started in X. It's now on Facebook, and others are trying it out, where users can sort of determine, they can make notes on things, and we can use that to mitigate some of the risks of information threats. I think there's another level and process that we can take, which actually takes it outside of the companies, because the problem even with a community note is the company still at the end of the day has some control of what can go on there, and bring it back into civil society where we can govern ourselves. And so what I would love to see is something where individuals can do that kind of research and make those kinds of notes outside of the platforms and then can post it on the platforms to broadcast it, but could do it outside of the platforms in a decentralized way where there is no company, there's no individual, and there's no government that has a centralized control over it. So whenever there's a centralized control, it can be hijacked for bad purposes. So decentralize it, bring it outside. The closest thing I've seen to that is Wikipedia, though even that still ultimately has the Wikipedia, foundation, and it has some centralization. But the closest thing we've seen to that is probably Wikipedia. I would like to see it go further in that direction. I think that's going to take some organizational and technological evolution and attempts to figure out the right way to do that. But that's what I think will ultimately need to happen.
I'm sticking with the TikTok example because you're absolutely right. It is a demonstrable threat, and not just wonderful little dog and cat videos there. But where do we go to prevent the next TikTok? And then what role does government and Congress have in place? Is it a stronger, a tech-focused CFIUS, for example? Because I remember when the TikTok app was banned very briefly, there was a surge of users to a effectively CCP owned and operated app that just took the Chinese users by surprise, because there's a whole bunch of Americans and English speakers on their app, which led to some very funny videos in of itself. But it was effectively a Chinese propaganda app through and through. So you went from bad to worse. So where do we go in order to help prevent that from happening in the future?
It was even worse than that, right? Because like the growth of that app was because on TikTok, the quote unquote algorithm, pushed those stories. They also, if you remember, pushed a story where they kind of made light of the whole thing, and people were making this joke saying hello to their Chinese, handler.
Yes.
Right. But that itself was pretty obviously an attempt that wasn't just like that accidentally the algorithm was doing that. It was an attempt by ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, to both kind of make light of it and play it down so they could win against Congress, but also ultimately the Chinese Communist Party to like retain TikTok, the TikTok beachhead in America. That's fundamentally the issue. Look, I think we need to I think once we acknowledge that there is a threat to the American people from information and from information control, and we realize that intelligence agencies like the MSS, China's version of the CIA, essentially, and see that as the threat, we can begin the process to then regulate it appropriately. And so today we actually do this, right? If you want to import food into America, we realize there is a threat that there might be food poisoning, or there might be disease in that it might affect our agricultural industry. So we regulate it, and we say, we see a threat here, we see a problem, you can't import that. You just can't do it. Well, once we see that information is equivalent, in that I'm drawing a bit of a parallel here, to a public health threat, right? Mm-hmm. We can then regulate it appropriately and say, and weigh the pros and cons of actually allowing that particular product into America. And then I think we can make the right choices. The actual means to implement the policy could be CFIUS, like you said, but there you can have an export restriction or an import restriction. There are many ways to implement the policy. I think it really, though, needs to come back to lawmakers and policymakers realizing that this is a threat to the American people in the same way as there are threats from food and lots of other things. And it's a safety issue for people, and that we should regulate it appropriately.
I want to bring this back because the subtitle of your book is The Future of Espionage and the Battle to Save America. And what you're describing is a necessary sense of urgency, a sense and appreciation of the threat. That if where we're recording this, I'm certainly inside the Beltway, there is that palpable sense. It is China is the pacing threat. The threat it poses to economics, political, military, diplomatic. You run down the list, it is clear. But if you go outside of Washington, you go to Middle America, that sense of threat isn't really necessarily shared at that sort of visceral level. And we're seeing it also in the United Kingdom right now. I'm a big Anglophile, but you're seeing the fight over the expansion or the new Chinese embassy next to Tower Bridge. and MI5's coming out and saying China is a material threat to the United Kingdom, and then they're going forward and say, no, it's not. The embassy's okay, go ahead. But it's this tension between military and intelligence saying there's a threat, politics struggling with it, and then the American people and sort of the British people, for lack of a better phrase as well, not necessarily sharing that. So, and how do you generate an appreciation of something that, as you're describing, and I agree, is such an acute challenge to American national economic security, but also just the very foundations of the freedoms that we enjoy?
It's you're pointing out such a hard issue right now, right? Think about it from, I'm also sitting within the Beltway right now, and I agree with you. Like here, most people sort of quote unquote get it, right? And they see the threat. As soon as you step outside, they don't necessarily do that. And I actually, when I was writing the book, used my wife as sort of my, researcher and like test case, because she does nothing related to national security before we got married, probably knew, like really essentially never thought about it. Like most Americans, most people thankfully don't have to think about national security. When we do, it means something has gone terribly wrong, like in 9/11, right? And so my wife and many other people in America will look at TikTok and say, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like I get on this app, it looks just like, Facebook or other apps. They collect my data as well. Why is this a big deal? And by the way, for the last 20 years, you've been telling me how good China is and how like it's great and they're becoming more democratic and they're manufacturing all our things. And my nephew, studied abroad there and had a wonderful time. And so I could see how it's confusing. And China, for its part, is playing that up. And they as a nation, do what we do, and they have public diplomacy and want the American people to see that they're doing good things in the world. And then for our government's part, we are meanwhile trying to balance. We want to be a free and open capitalist system and let in companies, and treat countries more or less equally where possible. And also, frankly, not completely and immediately decouple from the largest manufacturing center in the world, for which if we did decouple immediately, it would be an immediate, global economic depression. So all of those factors sort of add up, and it makes it very, very hard. And it can feel intractable. What I tried to do in the book, and I think is one step in gaining some traction in the issues. One, just explain in as I would say fact-based and calm a means as possible what's really going on in China and what the threat really is. I think a lot of people, for example, with TikTok, think that or will talk about the threat being data collection. That's not the threat. That's like a symptom of the threat. The threat is influence from the app. It doesn't really matter that they're collecting data. It's what are they doing with the data? And what they're doing with the data is trying to influence people in a way that is not good for Americans and is good for China. That's bad. That's what we don't want to happen. So part of what I think we need to do is start to explain really what's going on and do it in a way that people can understand. And I tried to do that a little bit in the book. The second thing is we need some solutions that will actually work. And if your solution, quote unquote, is, hey, we need $10 billion more per year to go to the CIA so they can do more of what they're doing, that's not a great solution. I think when a revolution happens, you need a completely different solution. And I think we need to start talking about other ways of doing things. And that's also what I tried to do in the book.
I mean, you write basically that you're looking to try to create civilian civic counterintelligence. And it sounds very much along the lines of the idea of building an information resilient society, a media savvy society. And there's been a lot of discussions from a lot of different angles. I mean, post Russian IRA influence operations, MSS and TikTok. But what does that look like in your mind? Because it's changing the idea of a citizen as a consumer of just pure information to a citizen, almost a citizen analyst.
I call it a citizen intelligence officer or citizen spy. And I do think that's essentially what we need to do. And it's not as crazy as it sounds. Look, 30 years ago, if you had given a speech to the American people and said, cybersecurity is this massive threat, and we need to train 300 million Americans on how to secure their computers, people would have looked at you like you were insane. First of all, they would have been like, what is cybersecurity? And then they would have been like, how are you going to train 300 million people to do this? It doesn't make sense. Are we all going to get master's degree in cybersecurity? So it wouldn't have made sense. But nonetheless, we actually did that. And now every American knows what cybersecurity is at some level. And has had some level of training. In fact, your average 8-year-old knows what cybersecurity is and understands that there is a password, that password has to occasionally be changed, that it's sort of similar to how somebody can steal your bike. They can kind of steal what's inside your computer. Like even an 8-year-old knows that now. And we sort of did it. And I think the way that we did it was we didn't expect the government to train everybody. We sort of took this approach where we realized there was this threat. We explained it in various ways in schools, in universities, in companies, in the government did it. The news did it, right? We took this sort of whole society approach to doing it. And we explained there was a threat, and then we started giving people specific things that they could do that were very easy to understand. Change your password. If an email looks funky, it might be something called phishing. We explained what phishing was, and then we explained what you should do. And we did that now we all think about it. Like we all get training. I don't care where you work. Like you could be working at Walmart or the Pentagon. You're getting kind of the same training on like, don't open a phishing email. So we did it. I think we sort of need to do the same thing. Explain, hey, look, there's this new threat. It affects all of us. Doesn't mean we all have to be paranoid, but remember, there are real threats. We used to hide under desks from nuclear weapons. Our children are currently, unfortunately, trained to hide from active shooters, right? There are threats. That's the reality of the world. This is a new one. It's information collection, intelligence collection, information operations. Here's how it affects you. It's a bad thing. Doesn't only affect you, it affects your family and your community. This isn't like an abstract thing happening in Washington. This is like your friends and family being affected, right? And you need to do something about it. And here are some things that you can do. You can, for example, triangulate information. That's something in intelligence. I'm going to give you an intelligence officer's tool, which is information triangulation. Intelligence officers never trust one source. They always check multiple sources. This does not involve getting a master's degree in intelligence studies. This is something that can be taught in school in an age-appropriate way and then repeated in training. And it doesn't have to, the CIA doesn't need to train you on this. A university can, an elementary school can, your company can. So we can kind of take, your fellow citizens can, a parent can teach their child to do this, right? And we need to take that kind of approach. That's how we're going to get there in the end.
We talked a little bit about the transformation of the intelligence community, the regulatory and oversight environment, but in this new sort of fourth intelligence revolution, what do the counterintelligence threats look like, and what does this new attack surface area look like? I mean, if we have a proliferation of independent citizen analysts, if you will, if we're using AI in new and novel ways, there's capabilities of poisoning AI, large language models. But what does the counterintelligence threat picture look like in your fourth intelligence revolution?
Yeah, it looks, first of all, in all of these revolutions, it's not like we ended one threat and then went to another. So 9/11 happened. We still had to worry about, foreign powers and nation states, but we added a new one, which was, we took very seriously decentralized terrorist organizations. The same thing is happening today. We're going to still have counterintelligence having to do with nation states, and we still have terrorists, and we still have to worry about all of those things. And all of those old technologies, social media threats still exist in the same way they did in 2016 when, the Russian IRA organization went and bought ads on Facebook. That still exists. There's one new threat that I would point out that I think is different now, and that arises from AI and specifically from chatbots, from LLMs like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. What's different and new here is that those chatbots are becoming the arbiters of information. It's where we all go to get information now. I don't know about you, but I've sort of stopped kind of Googling. I just sort of asked the question. And we're beginning to trust them. Like, people kind of trust them now. And there are studies showing how much we trust them. And the problem is that if those chatbots are poisoned in a way, as you say, to have a say the view of a foreign intelligence agency, then that poisoning, that the information operations can come through the chatbot in a new way. There's something called LLM grooming. I'm actually writing an article about this right now, where what the Russians have done, for example, is they have whole organizations, news organizations that push information not to people. They push it to the LLM models. That's who their audience is ChatGPT's, web scraping, Claude's web scraping, right? And then that information then ends up coming to the user and is how the information operation can be perpetrated. The other way that it can happen, so that's one way, it can be straight up hacked. There are various ways. The other thing that can happen is if you use an actual authoritarian country's chat system. So DeepSeek, which is a Chinese AI system, is still legal in America, and you can go download it right now, unfortunately. And just like TikTok, the CCP ultimately can control what goes on in DeepSeek, and so it can perpetrate an information operation. Now, what's different about this AI from just your traditional information operation is AI not only is like advertising where it can just tell you information, it enters into a dialogue with you and can actually persuade you. And that is way more powerful than anything in the past. And there are studies, in fact, there were just some studies released in December in Science and Nature, which are both scientific journals, showing that AI is 4 times or more powerful at politically persuading someone than traditional political advertising. So this is what we're up against. We have these AI systems that are far more powerful at persuading people to believe something, and they can be hijacked by a foreign power. And that is a major new counterintelligence threat. And we don't have great ways of figuring out how to protect ourselves, which is why, again, I think that the only way to protect ourselves is going to be to make the user, to make the endpoint, to make our minds more resilient through training and so forth.
So we're coming up at the tail end of the podcast here. And I have one very specific question, one kind of fun question, but I'll start with a specific one. We've talked a lot about sort of the citizen intelligence officer. We've talked a lot about AI and the changing technology and how it affects the fourth intelligence revolution. But what does the operations officer, the former case officer, do in this environment? I mean, how do you envision a new entrant who's going to the farm, who's going to deploy to a hostile environment or an allied environment? What are they going to do? I mean, how is their job and role going to change in this space? I mean, does human intelligence still matter?
It's an issue close to my heart. I used to be a case officer. I've recruited and handled sources all over, and some people sort of say what you're saying, that is there a role for the case officer? In fact, I think it's the opposite, and I think that the case officer is going to become the most important intelligence role, and it's actually going to grow, and we're going to see a lot more case officers in the future, because here's what I think is going to happen. We, as a society, globally, are seeing that anything online can be faked, and we're starting to actually get to a point where we just kind of, I think, aren't going to trust anything online. If it's on a screen, we're just going to say, that might be fake. I don't know. If it's somebody talking to me, it's like, is that really a person? I don't know. Maybe they look like that. Maybe they don't. We're just not going to trust anything online. And the only way to gain trust with another person is going to be in person. And it's going to be with removing your, I don't know, augmented reality glasses and your AirPods and all of the things. And it's just one person talking to another person together in the same location at the same time. And that is going to be the only way we're going to gain any level of trust for other human beings. And when that happens, the only way to truly, recruit someone to get information that can't be gotten in any other way is going to be to have a person go there who speaks that language, who knows that culture, who can build trust over time, connect with another human being and get them to trust them, and ultimately give them secrets. And we are going to always need new secrets, right? And there are all sorts of new secrets we need to know. Okay, so you're building AI and autonomous systems. Well, some person is building that, right? And I need to know how they're building it and where maybe there's a weakness or something that is going to allow me to mitigate the threat from that AI or autonomous system, right? Yeah, maybe we do have a future where it's robots battling robots in the sky, like drone on drone warfare. Somebody's building those drones, somebody's building that software, a person is in charge at some level. That's the person that I, as a case officer, am going to need to talk to, right? And know how that's working, or maybe change how it's working or something like that. And so people are going to do that. We're going to need even more case officers.
So I'm a huge fan of John le Carre. My favorite books are Spy Who Came From the Cold and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of it is because I love the character of George Smiley. It is the anti Jason Bourne, it's the anti James Bond. But if we take what you just described and we look at a 21st century George or Jane Smiley, what do they look like in 2030 and 2035? What are the skill sets that you are looking at in terms of everything that we've discussed today? And then I also have to ask what your favorite spy film would be.
The there's this kind of Clausewitz, he was kind of a theorist of war. Clausewitz quote, he says, the character of war may change, but the nature of war always remains the same. And intelligence is kind of the same. The character is going to change. There's case officers, they're going to use all sorts of new intelligence. Look, 40 years ago, they were probably hand developing film secretly in like a bathroom in a hotel room in Soviet Russia, right? We stopped doing that. By the time I went to the farm, we were doing very different things, right? And in the future, they're probably going to need to know how to use all sorts of AI to help them deal with ubiquitous technical surveillance and so forth to operate. But the nature of what it's going to be a case officer is going to be the same. And I suspect the types of people, the personality traits they're going to be the same types of people as George Smiley or anyone who operated during the Cold War and so forth, which is, you need to be able to connect with people. You need to be able to, manipulate and convince people to do things for you. You need to have, frankly, a high risk tolerance, an ability to operate alone in environments that are uncomfortable or even threatening, right? All of those things are going to be the same kind of person. You're going to have, cynical, cynical middle-aged, men and women who have seen it all and can kind of look and say, spot a person across the room in a diplomatic function and say, that's the guy. That person has the information and I know how to go talk to them. We're still going to need the same thing. So, there's a certain comfort in that, right? That people are still going to matter. And that's how the world will still function in the future, no matter how much AI we put there.
And so the favorite spy film?
I really like Spy Game. That's the one I always, people ask me all the time which ones are realistic and which ones are not. And frankly, I don't watch a lot of spy films because I find it frustrating. And I'm, my wife hates it. We're watching a movie and I'll be like, what's he doing? He just did his SDR. He knows he's clean. Why is he, I'm like picking apart these guys' operations. I'm like, this makes absolutely no sense. But what was great about, Spy Game, beyond, it's Robert Redford and Brad Pitt, like amazing cast, is it showed like inside the building, you've got Robert Redford sort of playing this sort of game that happens inside the building. And you've got Brad Pitt in the field doing the field stuff, and they're like communicating. And, I've been on both sides of that equation. I've been out in the field wondering like, what the hell is going on in Washington? Why are they telling me this? Like, I know that there are games going on, and then I've been in Washington, in a senior role, kind of playing the game, as it were, trying to get funding and worrying about the Hill and worrying about all of these things going on. And I think that movie is great at sort of encapsulating that tension, and it's just a fun movie.
Yeah, it's criminally underrated. I have to agree with you on that one. But I think on that note, it's going to bring our latest episode to a close. I want to thank Anthony for joining us today. Thanks as always to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. And as always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate and review and subscribe. And most importantly, pick up The Fourth Intelligence Revolution. It is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. Incredibly thought-provoking. And the conversation that we just had only scraped the top of the surface because there's so much more in here that I wanted to get to. So we might have to have you back for a second episode. But Anthony, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.